Welcome back to the cybernetic communism conversation. I'm Yohanan Ben Zion, voice crying out in the wilderness for a technological New Jerusalem. Emphasis on the technological. Right? You're not going to build a world which is quite nearly in possession of things like recursion, that is AI recursion, self-improving AI or such effects. The effects of superintelligence may not be exclusively recursive in that multiplicative way, but they are similarly transformative if used correctly, which they're not being used correctly. This cannot be done when you're standing on a foundation of sand that is religious literalism and cultural properties of times past. And that, you use this language that would be suggestive of something like that, like a nom de guerre, Yohanan Ben Zion. What other sort of nom de guerre would you suggest? Right? Should I use should I have chosen many years ago before I was a scientific communist an alphanumeric designation, an in joke that only I would get, or should I try to choose something that might have some resonance with people, even in this Eurocentric paradigm, which I despise but cannot escape. And I apologize if in some other life I gave people an impression that, oh, Ben Zion, where do you go to shul? Okay, I apologize if I've ever given anyone the impression that this is something other than a nom de guerre. But at the same time, the kind of people that have been subjected to that cultural confusion, pretty specifically right-wing think tank rats and fucking feds, people who are a little bit too omnicidal, hyper-capitalistic evildoer to really be in a position to complain about somebody doing some cultural appropriation within the Eurocentric paradigm that they uphold. All of this is garbage, and these are people who should be in the gulag, should be fired into the sun. So I wouldn't really apologize to them. And thinking about this kind of thing, activism in the United States. I've talked about this before. Someone goes on a red note, or the Chinese application known as Mao's Little Red Book, and the Westerner, a U.S. person, and they're talking about the problems of the omnicidal and corrupt United States, and the Chinese person says, quite wisely, I've heard that the organizations in the United States that claim to be revolutionary are infiltrated by police, so much so that some of them 80% fake people in the organization, which might be an overstatement, but I don't think by very much in some cases, based on my experience. And how can you even operate? And that has been my experience. Right? I'd much rather be a voice crying out in the wilderness, reaching a couple of people here and there, and working on funded projects within this far-right neoliberal think tank rat working space, things that would have the opposite effect of what they're supposed to. The title of this is Your AI SLOP versus your AI apotheosis. Apotheosis is a pretty fancy word and pretty theological word for what I would see as the possibility in an AI takeoff, a people's AI takeoff, of real utopian outcomes. The people, they don't respond so consistently to utopian concepts or utopian language, and perhaps quite correctly, right? It's a massive body of work that I've immersed myself in as much as I have been able to, of scientific socialist, scientific communist, liberation and revolutionary writing that is quite dubious, and correctly so, of the utopian, of the idealist. None of those people, however, were living through an AI takeoff as you are now. And fortunately, that's a bourgeois AI takeoff. That's hastening the effects of the omnicide. That's hastening the enslavement of humankind by the techno-fascist, the hyper-capitalist, the American, the American oligarch, the people who you think are representative of yourself. Well, if you're a person from this continent, this accursed place, you think that Trump and Elon Musk represent you. They represent hell. They represent the burning alive of everyone on Earth, right? Why did this person who made a career of being a greenwasher, a person who was making business sectors viable, wasn't doing that, but he made a career of being perceived as doing that. Why did this person suddenly turn to working more closely with Donald Trump than he's worked with really anyone? Donald Trump being the world's most notorious climate denier, a person with an agenda quite nearly diametrically opposed to that of a person who was actually trying to build sustainability into the industrial capitalism that's killing the planet, or the industrial sectors of financial capitalism that's killing the planet. It's not too accurate to refer to the U.S. or any place as industrial capitalist. You can read Michael Hudson. The point being, while the industrial sectors that exist are extremely environmentally destructive, the system in which that destruction has really occurred is a system more of casino capitalism than the industrial capitalism that doubled the life expectancy, say, from 1770 to 1900, which, I should add, was dramatically outpaced by the state socialist form, which was able to double life expectancy in a quarter of a century, so being 4 to 5 times more efficacious. And that's pretty clearly understood when you look at what happened in the Soviet Union from from around 1920 to around 1945, from around 1925 to 1950, or when you look at what happened in China from around 1960 to 1985, and that process is ongoing. But the doubling of life expectancy, that 4 to 5-fold improvement over the industrial capitalist form, that should be the story of state socialism. But it's not, because it's filtered through the agenda of the CIA-run world that has just no interest in truth, no interest in viability, no interest in the 8.3 billion people on this planet. Solid percentage of them people who are not merely somewhat exploited, who are not merely having their labor values stolen or living under a wage slave system, but who are living in a hell indistinguishable from that of chattel slavery, or the forcing of native people to work in mines and fields that preceded the U.S. chattel slavery system that perhaps you're more familiar with, but it's a continuation of these projects, and those projects are ongoing because something like 1 billion people live in that hell today. They never have a proper food or sufficient water or the other necessaries of life, are extremely limited. There are no formation even of a public health service at all for these people, no formation of a housing authority for these people, or a job guarantee for these people. They don't even have even the utilities that were being built were destroyed by forces like the imperial fascistic United States and its odious North Atlantic Western allies. These things, not just physically taking grenade launcher, blowing up water infrastructure. that's not how they did it. Right? The neo-colonial project is debt traps, and all of the violence that hides behind respectability politics. A person in the United States who would aspire to be respectable, my God, a lot of this conversation about AI SLOP, it's protecting that accursed system. Like, you're talking about reforming IP laws and the IP system to better represent the worker. That's not a thing that a communist would discuss. A communist would discuss the abolition of copyright itself, and that is not. You like you say that to these people, and they're just dumbfounded, or they just change the subject. They just ignore it, right? But that's not beyond the pale, as these people would say or tend to suggest, right? Just as the doubling of life expectancy from 1925 to 1950 in the Soviet Union, it occurred in a country that was not perfect, but a country that had done this thing of taking measures to limit private wealth to such a degree that it was on track to that true full abolition of financial capital. And by doing so, and by building things, actually have to build things to help people too in that context. Something sometimes lost on our Trotskyist friends. By building things like a housing authority, a public health service, jobs programs, and focusing on seeing that people's needs are met. It wasn't always glamorous. But by doing those things, this rapid acceleration over those effects that were produced by industrial capitalism in the century and a half prior, and that was a copy leftist frame, right? There was no, I don't know if I should reference this film, but if you watch the film Tetris, which isn't a particularly good film, I watched it because it's kind of about the Soviet Union. But if you're not already a person well versed in scientific communist thought, I would urge you to maybe do that before watching something like this, because it's just kind of neoliberal propaganda. But in that film, you have some people coming to a Soviet worker and saying, how do we get this software so that we can sell it and distribute it, this game. And the Soviet worker says, we just don't have the framework for that because everything is held in common. So software is naturally open source. That's a correct thing to do. Just as building a humane and sustainable economic system is the correct thing to do, but it's been quite easily circumvented or sabotaged by the forces of the ruling elites in this world. It's a horror. It's a horror that that's been done. It's a horror that people basically balked on the Westerner. Basically balked. Because also a thing that happened in just a quarter of a century is the more advanced industrial capitalist world went from having basically only disorganized or lowest stage labor organizing, impromptu labor organizing. This is a wildcat strike. We're leaving. We're pissed and we're leaving. To organized labor unions that were spanning continents. But not just that in a quarter of a century, but went from having zero to having 100. Admittedly low form state socialism, but state socialism. That occurred in a quarter of a century. You went from 0 to 100 in a quarter of a century. That was what Vladimir Lenin had lived through when he predicted a world revolution in his time. So a world revolution in the 1930s. He didn't live into the 1930s, but that was his prediction. And he wasn't the one who fucked up by saying that. The rest of us are the ones who fucked up by not doing that, by allowing, the Hitlers and Mussolinis of the world to have their way. Like, who was Mussolini? A violent person, right? Anti-communist person, a socialist turned lunatic. His father would have been rolling over in his grave if he saw what he was doing, right? Because his father was an actual socialist. He was raised in a red diaper baby. British intelligence, some of the worst people that have ever lived, like this U.S. CIA-run world. The world would be a dramatically better place without those two things specifically. U.S. and British intelligence might not even be dying if that CIA-run world had not been rolled out. Certainly not at this pace. But British intelligence came to Mussolini and said, well, hey, why don't you try this other thing? We'll give you a briefcase full of money and secretly fund this cool, fascistic, anti-communist thing that you're doing. Who knows? Maybe it'll work. Maybe it'll be for the best. Obviously not for the best. And that's pretty well everyone in the U.S. going along with that sort of thing, but because it looks to be quite white shoe, it looks to be on the up and up, has this thin veneer of respectability politics on it. It's not seen as that, but it absolutely is that. Yeah. The United States brought in quite literally millions of not just Nazis in Project Paperclip, but anytime one of their imperial fascistic projects had some success, they would allow the victors of those imperial fascistic campaigns to come to the U.S. So millions and millions of people who were just fascists, then they come into positions of prominence, as was the case with Project Paperclip, right? Werner Braun maybe the most visible kind of example of this, right? A literal Nazi, right? A person who the Soviets would have correctly shot if the U.S. hadn't, and the UK, pretty particularly those two, hadn't stopped them from doing that. And so, but instead he becomes the face of of NASA. Right? So these aren't just people who are like living in a hovel in secret. Right? They're integrated into every sector at the highest level, or just kind of handed the ability to build a thriving concern. Right? Like no native or new African, no Turtle Islander or new African is handed the ability to build a thriving concern. And when they are able to build a thriving concern, what happens? The Tulsa massacre, or the events such as occurred in the Martin Scorsese film, this most recent Martin Scorsese film starring Lily Gladstone. That's a recurring theme. That's a recurring event. Is extreme violence. The building of the system to prevent Turtle Islanders and New Africans, the only people who really have a leg to stand on as being North Americans, and I would include amongst those Turtle Islanders really a lot of Chicano people in the U.S. as well. So it's more complicated, but the land was stolen from them, and their history was stolen from them as well. The opposite of what's done for European war criminals is done at every turn to New Africans and Turtle Islanders, so much so that from birth, a New African male can expect to be falsely imprisoned on chicken shit charges, their life cut short. They can expect all of these things to happen. The United States has about 4% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners, pretty specifically to do this white supremacist thing, this Eurocentric paradigm violence thing of keeping Turtle Islanders and New Africans from being in a position to assert correctly that they are the rightful owners of all of this. And that is done in so many ways, beyond just these kind of Project Paperclip things that occurred, and just, it's an ongoing project. Trump seeking and destroying students who've come to study in the U.S. Who are even slightly anti-fascistic, just having them thrown out of the U.S. That's just a continuation of the Project Paperclip thing that was done a little more in secret. Right? Trump just doesn't even try to do those things in secret, and he'll just do it even more outlandish thing, although not necessarily more destructive thing. Right? Because Trump's policy to do with immigration, which is a pretty nice word for what is uniformly genocidal activities across the Western world. That's world of borders, a thing that in just a slightly different context is described as a genocidal war crime. It's just the standard operating procedure of European and heavily European descended countries. That's nuts, right? And you can't even talk to a person who would tend to be in positions of power in those countries about that, because that cognitive dissonance is too intense for them. Like you say, this policy of this happens over and over again in the Mediterranean in the last few years. Just boat blows up, 1,000 people, just blows up. So why did this boat blow up so many times with a bunch of people on it? Well, those people were um, Africans or global Southerners, desperately trying to um, 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 avoid the problems of your sins, right? The capitalist climate apocalypse, that's the North American sins. That's the British's sins. That's the Eurocentric paradigm sins. That's the world that the U.S. hegemon has insisted on by building these fossil fuel products and exporting them as much as possible to every other corner of the earth, by insisting upon this casino capitalist set of systems, this neo-colonialist set of systems, these omnicidal systems. So those people have already been harmed by your systems. And then, when they seek to avoid literally just being drowned, or they're running from this manufactured strife of financial capital, you blow up their boat. Right? And then you blame them. You blame them. Or you'll dismiss it all and say, it's so sad. It's so sad, but what can we really do? We, the worst people who have ever existed. What can we really do? I had some notes. I was going to be focusing a little more on the controversies of recent days to do with advanced computing. And the main thing that you would say is that this AI art backlash, this is a preferable position to the, the activities of these for-profit, omnicidal, far-right neoliberal hyper-capitalist animals, the U.S. corporations and the U.S. establishment. But that's a bad framing, right? Comrade Lenin has written entire major works on the subject. That just because something's ostensibly against imperial fascism, but it's not rooted in scientific communists, that is a thing to be preferred or a thing to be folded into a more authentically liberatory operation. Like, you're alive. You could be working with other people to do the right thing instead of saying, oh well, the neoliberal narrative and also this neoliberal counter narrative, those are the only two options. What are you gonna do? That's again the omnicide. That's the omnicide. That's Molech talking. That's not a person talking. He says, what are you going to do? I prefer the omnicide light over omnicide. Those are both really bad. And, you could be resisting or agitating, in communist circles. There was a repudiation of the in recent years a repudiation of the propaganda of the deed, or let's say specifically the actions of I'm not sure that it was Luigi Mangione. I'm not sure that that's really what we're really seeing reality with that story, but the CEO Slayer. The CEO Slayer may not have been Luigi Mangione. May have been a real comrade, or something rather more like a real comrade than Luigi Mangione. But the dismissal of the propaganda of the deed, I'll read a post on Twitter from just not so long ago. This is a post from a comrade who I believe to be on the up and up, not just a liar, not just a person helping to either uphold the far-right neoliberal narrative or counter-narrative at every turn, as really most Americans are tending to do. But my response to something they said, so this person is named Fiona Lally, at Fiona underscore Lally, Lali, and Fiona Lally says you should be a communist. And that's 5 words and punctuation, a period. And I got 27,000 views even in this anti-communist, more anti-communist version of Twitter than used to exist. That's the reason that Elon Musk bought this for $44 billion over its market value, dramatically over, because he's not somebody who's fixing industrial sectors to make them environmentally viable. He's a greenwasher. He's a career greenwasher. He's a CIA mega asset whose job is to pretend to do those kinds of things. And CIA mega asset's job is also to destroy the marketplace of ideas as it becomes increasingly more revolution minded. And that would be a fair assessment of what's happened to Twitter in recent years. So Fiona Lally says you should be a communist. That's correct. And my response, which was only viewed by a handful of people thus far, says should be, quote, scare quotes, should be is right, because none of us has worked a single solitary shit as a revolutionary, as long as one brick of the omnicidal Pentagon is still standing upon another. Still quoting my tweet. And we're alive and could be doing something about it. Right? So that's an assessment of an honest statement, but it would also be the kind of thing that would be an indictment of a response to the propaganda of the deed, right? The person, a communist, well versed in scientific thought of centuries past, would say, with good reason, that you should not be adventurist, that you should not be engaging in the propaganda of the deed, that the right thing to do is cadre revolutionary violence, organized, more organized action, more focused on ending financial capital and empire. And that's a correct sentiment. That's a correct sentiment, right? But we have this ticking time bomb of the capitalist climate apocalypse that will have effectively exploded at or around 2029, leading to runaway overheating. Every credible climate scientist is screaming right now about things just in recent days. We've said that we've seen the collapse of 80% of the bee population in the United States. This is because of these fossil fuel concerns, who create specific kinds of pollutants, pesticides that kill insects, and also create a world where life generally is increasingly less viable because of their other omnicidal activities, fossil fuel related or other. What happens after 2029? We reach runaway overheating. We reach cascading effects of other of these things like ecocidal collapse. That's a world where we're fast-tracked to non-existence as a species. So when you say we need a cadre to stop that, without first saying that there's a ticking time bomb, I think that you're tending to do something in bad faith, because what you're really saying is, well, the subtext of what you're saying is we need this cadre, which would take some years, potentially take some years to build, years that we don't have. And so to say that the person doing the propaganda of the deed, say, um, taking out a high-profile figure like a CEO of an insurance scammer concern, um, to say that that person is wrong, you're uh, as wrong as they are, when you fail to really describe the time that this timeline, this ticking time bomb, this world that we live in. Many people describing themselves as scientific communists are doing, even though they're saying the right thing, they're doing something that's essentially idealist because they're not living in the moment that we live in. And so that would not be saying the right thing. We have to say, um, and what I've tried to do and articulate that is to describe this um, um, advanced computing, so-called AI effects, as the most powerful revolutionary tool that's ever existed. A thing which we could build into something powerful enough to stop the capitalist climate apocalypse. Um, so when I meet a technophobic scientific communist, a person who says the cadre must be built through 19th and 20th century means, I wish they were right. I wish that there were those millions of people, operating in stealth mode, so as not to be detected by the fascist intelligence agencies and this instruments of fascist violence. I'd like to think that there are millions of them preparing their AR-15s to march on the white man's house, the White House in D.C., and the Pentagon, the pentagram, to destroy those things, to demand the stop of the capitalist climate apocalypse. I'd like to think that those technophobic scientific communists are winning, or about to strike the coup de grace. But that's not reality, is it? That cadre is not built to that. So we have to use all of the weapons at our disposal, at all of us, at every time, in the best way that we can, to see the preservation of our species into more decades than it seems that we have now. And that would not be limited to advanced computing. That would be doing all of the things that revolutionaries have previously done, as well as possible, and including this force multiplier of advanced computing. And I made some art a few days ago, and I've shared it, so some thousands of people, I guess, maybe have seen it, or at least had some impression of it. Not a large number. It's extremely hard to be a person doing agitation and propaganda, or consciousness raising in this world. You'll be shadow banned. You'll be subjected to things just short of what Trump exported. Yesterday was Cesar Chavez Day in the United States, celebrating an important labor organizer, an important a labor organizer of Mexican descent. Another such person, just days before, the 21st century Cesar Chavez, a labor organizer, was deported by the same mechanisms which pro-Palestine students are being deported. In that poem, first they came for the communists. They don't say, first they came for some other, a more liberalistic person. They say first they came for the communists. So the U.S. national, who is a communist, they might not be sent to a prison death camp in El Salvador illegally, but they'll be subjected to forces on that order of magnitude, that level of disruption and destruction as a community, just not so garishly so. Talking about communities, not individuals. And this this artwork that I made was made with an open source AI art generator, a controversial action to use an open source AI art generator. And it shows a Pusheen type cat, but looking a little more 3D than you would usually see, and realistic than you would usually see that character looking. And this cat is a communist, cybernetic communist Pusheen cat, and he's holding a blowtorch and a wrench, and he's wearing a red shirt with a red star on it, and he's working on a robot. It looks like a robot, but then you see that it's an Earth globe, a robot that he's trying to repair. It's surrounded by destruction and mayhem. And it says, rebuild a cybernetic communist world, start vibe coding the people's superintelligence today. And that's 11, 12 words. That probably could be broken down a little bit. For example, rebuild suggests that, perhaps falsely, that a cybernetic communist world had already existed and need to be rebuilt, but rather should, more correctly, if you were not trying to economize that space, say, rebuild this broken world into a cybernetic communist world. And vibe coding should also be explained. That's the ability to do quite high level programming without a programming background, by using the same open source, the exact same open source LLM that I described, making this art, like Qwen, QWEN, or others, any other that's open source. You can also use that to be a project manager on your own without a programming background, by just doing this thing called vibe coding, where you tell the LLM what you want to do as a developer, and you say, I don't know how to do it though, and then it says, okay, open up this prompt, open up the notepad, open up another instantiation of notepad, open up these three programs, hopefully open source programs on your open source operating system if possible. And when you open up those three programs and you copy this program and copy here, copy this program and copy here, put this in the prompt, I hit enter. When you do a process along those lines a few thousand times, or tens of thousands of times, now you've built an application. What kind of application would I urge you to do in this way? I would urge you to actually repurpose an open source large language model, which are already built to respond to prompts and have some network activity. But we can build that into this people's superintelligence, which also would require some description. A people's superintelligence, as opposed to the incipient omnicidal bourgeois superintelligence that's being built by most of the people in the United States in one way or another, whether they're vibe coding or working for a programming concern or not. They're upholding this omnicidal set of systems, if not actively trying to build this omnicidal set of systems into something worse. But the people's superintelligence is an alternative to that, and it, pretty particularly would be an open source large language model agent workforce multiplier, a work group in the many millions with a core of AI agents of a semi-autonomous kind who are able to work with one another and be steered by the same essential functioning of the LLM, the prompt, by the comrades who have downloaded the specially tailored open source LLM platform. The AI agent is able to do a lot of work, but the person and the citizen, the good comrade who's downloaded this thing, is required to do very little work. They might be answering just a few yes or no questions throughout the course of a day or week, or a limited amount of work product in the spirit of that. But nevertheless, they would be able, when this thing grows to some scale, maybe not hundreds of millions, but some scale, it would be a thing that, as a workforce multiplier, because of this property of AI agents being easily replicated and being tireless, a relatively small number of people would be able to put the necessary pressure to stop the omnicide, to transform these industrial bases. Studies have suggested that when at the highest level of organization, 4% of people become revolution minded in any given country, they can produce a revolutionary effect. They can, for example, convert a bourgeois state to a state socialist form. That is a thing to aspire to. But in a place as accursed as the United States, there are tremendous forces preventing that, so much so that 4% might be a little bit of an optimistic number. So the question you would ask yourself is, what can you do? And this is a question that I ask myself when I come to this concept of building this vanguard network, this open source large language multiplier, this people's superintelligence. That was a very question that I asked myself. What can you do to bring that number down from 4% or whatever number, higher number that would be required in the US? What could you do to bring that number down? And I think that with this workforce multiplying effect, a number could be reduced significantly, maybe to something closer to 1%, or to something closer to a range that could actually be done in the US in this time frame that we're talking about. Again, we don't have all the time in the world. We have till 2029 to stop. We can't reverse the effects of the climate apocalypse, but we can stop them. And I hope that you would consider doing this kind of work. I used to say I hope that you will email me and that we can work on this together. But some of the people I started to talk to people in an organization called the Moneyless Society, who admittedly a little bit too liberalistic to really do this kind of work, but who have an organization and who would tend to sometimes work on a thing along these lines. But when they found out before he was a scientific communist, Johann Ben Zion had done transhumanist things or weird things, then they were no longer interested in working with me. So I'm forced to be a mere voice crying out in the wilderness. But you could do this thing of uniting the people, of using a high automation. But you can't do it if you're focused on how the idea of software is bad. right? You're not, you haven't thrown a Molotov cocktail at OpenAI, right? Their headquarters is still there, but you're upset that people are using software. You're upset at the people, right? um, um, right, like this AI backlash. It's a joke, right? Like there is, if you were a good way, to describe this, um, anti is this is anti-automation, right? So if you don't want to be anti-automation, you want to be taking direct anti-capitalist action, not railing vaguely at the problem in a more general way that doesn't specifically focus on destroying forces of empire and financial capital. So this is an anti-automation backlash, and automation, that is the thing by which financial capital in a century and a half, and or rather industrial capital systems in a century and a half, and state socialist systems, humble as they have been, in only a quarter of a century, a dramatically faster pace, we're able to double life expectancies. Those kind of effects, the improvement of life and viability, would derive from high automation used properly. So to be anti-automation is to be just the stupidest creature on earth. But again, that's still preferable to the activity of the hyper-capitalist. But what that is essentially the neoliberal and imperialist narrative and counter-narrative being totally controlled, and no one actually saying, well, we have to do what needs to be done to save ourselves. No one actually even being allowed to contemplate that. But to put this in perhaps about as few words as possible, high automation communism versus this technophobic communism is to actual communism in our time versus no communism at all ever, because no one is left on Earth. So again, I wouldn't tell you to just make jokes about anti-AI people, like just like the fucking tech bros are doing. Just share a picture of art that I made making fun of you. Like, that's not the appropriate response. You have to actually say all of this. You actually have to be better than the anti-AI, essentially capitalistic crowd, or you are. If you're not willing to say all that, if you're not able to say all that, then you are actually worse than them. But again, you all have moral agency, right? You all could be better than you are now, and I know that you're not that good. Right? I know because the Pentagon is still standing, because the Shell Oil is still standing, because Tesla headquarters is still standing, because of this, the demonic white man's house in D.C. is still standing. Right? The project, their project, murdering all humankind, is still ongoing. So I know that you're not that good, right? If there were any of you who were that good and that smart and that organized, this would have not ever have been a problem in the first place, and it would not be ongoing. It certainly would not be ongoing. So you have to say all of this. You just have to. And you have to take the hit of them ignoring you or crying or laughing and saying that you're not being realistic, right? A person who doesn't want the species to be extinct is not realistic. A person who's going along with the extinction of the species, but that's a realistic person, right? Again, it's 1 in 1,000 European descended people who shouldn't just be summarily executed in just a slightly less diabolical world than the one that we live in a slightly less ridiculous world than the one we live in. But these are the people who represent the systems that dictate terms to all. This neo-colonial noose slipped around the neck of every global southerner, destroying their governments. You know, if you haven't read the Jakarta Method, I'll tend to recommend over and over again a couple of books like Endless Holocausts by Smith. If you haven't read the Jakarta Method, however, I would say it's not possible for you to be a serious 21st century scientific communist, particularly living in the Western world. Um, um, uh, you've got to read that book, right? The colonial violence of centuries past, of the 20th century, the neo-colonial violence taking on other forms, you know, a meme, a kind of meme that occurred in the wake of the CEO Slayer. One such meme that's relevant to this is, just because the murder weapon is paperwork does not mean that a murder was not committed. Right? And a respectable Westerner will hide behind that lie. Ooh, a lot of harm to this world is done by that lie. Well, I guess I think I've done justice to the title. I had one or two other things that I was going to discuss. But I didn't write down an outline. I suppose a person watching this kind of video would say, Jesus, man, it's doom and gloom. Talking about extinction and being consumed by fire. You know, I feel like I'm reading, I'm looking at the 21st century version of the book of Revelation. I mean, that's just reality, right? But a better world is possible. Stopping the capitalist climate apocalypse is a low bar in this world of a cybernetic communist insurgency of some scale. It's a low bar, right? It is, you know, these false, the false consciousness of the terrestrial folks, the singularitarians, the transhumanists, the hyper-capitalists, all of those terrestrial folks, effective accelerationists. These are all quite bad people. They're all selling a bill of goods in the form of trickle-down economics with some sci-fi mumbo-jumbo thrown in to make it palatable again. Because trickle-down economics has already been sold. All of these people, one of the more consistent things among these disparate communities would be an interest in seeing something called longevity escape velocity reached. People, automation succeeding to such a degree that it's possible for someone to outpace the force of disease and decrepitude in their own body. Some people have said that point has already been reached for the super rich, and that is a point worth repeating, that it is a thing for the super rich in these people's minds. And I know this because I have interacted with and met people in this longevity community, and virtually none of them is advocating for or fighting for a single-payer public health service that is AI powered in those ways that would lead to universal super longevity. So they're not even upholding longevity by the standards of a 1940, not even a state socialist form, right? A Keynesian capitalist nation was able to build a single-payer public health service by the standards of 1940. And an AI-powered one would be able to achieve universal super longevity. And by the forced multiplication and reorientation of our world, we could see universal super longevity based on that AI-powered single-payer public health serve as principle in every land for everyone who wants it. Everyone could reach indefinite lifespan. Everyone on Earth, quite easily. But not as long as private wealth, filthy lucre, stolen, commodified labor value from the worker in every land continues to exist. As long as financial capital and empire are allowed to exist and their interests are prioritized over everything else, such effects will never be achieved. So that world that Comrade Lenin foresaw of world revolution in his lifetime, it was stolen from you. He wasn't wrong to think that. The bad actors, the ruling elites, were wrong to steal that from you. You know, a little more understandable example in the context of cybernetic communism is something where that outcome had been put on pause by the forces of financial capital and counter-revolutionary violence and sabotage. But again, it reared its head. The possibility of a true takeoff reared its head by the 1970s when Salvador Allende, who was more state socialist than revolutionary capitalist, he was not inclined. He had built state socialism through more reformist means than communists had generally done. But he had built state socialism of a unique kind, such that he was building a technological planned economy, quite sophisticated, built on advanced cybernetics principles, not using the highest technology even by the 1970 standards, but nevertheless a technological planned economy that would have allowed people to do dramatically more with dramatically less, would have essentially been a springboard to another timeline, another people's superintelligence, but nevertheless that still would have been a takeoff effect. But that was destroyed by imperial fascists, particularly of the United States, although it's always a project of collusion between people who have no regard for borders. This is why is Elon Musk even in the United States, right? He's raised in another country. This oligarchic criminal has no land. They are more internationalistic in a certain sense than the general public in most places are, but that internationalistic quality is the quality of elite entitlement to rack and ruin, not an actually internationalistic orientation. So that universal super longevity and wonders beyond, as I say in my mantra, that is a lower bar to what we could achieve. But those wonders beyond, some of them don't deserve to be described at length until such time as those billion human beings who are living in slavery conditions are liberated. That is the priority as high and parallel to the stopping of the capitalist climate apocalypse. But we will, if we do this thing, see those wonders beyond. The artificial intelligence singularity is nigh, and wonders to behold beyond imagining. And on that fateful day you will rise, and all humankind will become as one. For you see, very soon, my dear comrade, cybernetic communism will win. Thank you.